we are the only human beings alive right now in the history of our species who are witnessing, not only witnessing, but are the main cause for a shift in geological ages. We are passing out of the 65 million year period, the so-called Cenozoic, which began with the extinction of the dinosaurs and more than half of all life on the planet when a giant asteroid hit the Yucatan Peninsula. So we're now at the the beginning phases, but quickly accelerating phases of the sixth mass extinction, the last one to have happened since 65 million years ago. So we're literally the first humans to be on the planet during a mass extinction. But not only that, and that's the kind of collective near-death experience that we're all involved in right now, that more and more people are becoming aware of. But the other side of that is that we are not only the first humans, but really the first life forms on the planet who are starting to wake up and realize that we are the planet. Because obviously humans are not other than the life, the web of life out of which we've emerged. We are that web of life, but we're that part of the web of life that has, for whatever reason, developed the ability to become conscious that we exist, that we are part of this web of life. And we, in our own time, we've finally come up with a pretty amazing coherent story of the history of our own emergence from the Big Bang, as you said, 14.6 billion years ago, and the origin of this planet for 13 point something billion years. That the years keep switching. The origin of our own planet, 4.6 billion years ago. So we're now piecing together a coherent story of our own emergence as life on the planet, just at that point where that very web is starting to unravel. So these are the two sides. An emergence of planetary consciousness, of which we humans seem to be the primary carriers, and the threat of the unraveling of life itself, and we are the cause of that threat. So this is the unparalleled, paradoxical, poignant, terrifying, and wondrous moment that we all find ourselves in.
Yeah, boy, well put. The framing that we have to step back and say, no one's ever been here before. We don't know. We are daring to grapple with so many elements that our science is teaching us, but that consciousness is emerging with, that is happening on the planet to our fellow planet mates and to ourselves, all in this amazing paradox, I think is a beautiful word, where we're living, as Joanna Macy says, we're living in three places at once. There's business as usual, where I'm about to go have dinner with my girlfriend and everything seems easy and normal, but there's this incredible unraveling that's happening all around us and this incredible planetary consciousness. So I'd love to hear you, now that we've got the framework of that, start with me and within a couple of minutes, tell the story of the universe, how it starts and swirls and moves from there.
Well, I don't know if I can tell the story of the universe, but but the neat thing is that we do have such a story. Of course, humans, we've always had stories of our own origins and so on, and they're beautiful stories, and they tell our nature and our history in ways that the scientific story can't do. But the neat thing about the scientific view is that there's consensus now among pretty much all scientists around a single story of our emergence out of some mysterious singularity, which is another word for God, I guess, or the great mystery. And all of matter energy seems to have mysteriously emerged from that point, immediately giving rise to an expanding universe. And so somehow, and we know the stages and we know the various thresholds that have been crossed from the first condensation of the first particles out of the infinite sea of quantum energy. That happens very, very soon. And right after that, light suffuses the whole cosmos, galaxies start to form. And within the billions and billions of galaxies, including our own Milky Way, which is the only one that we have any direct acquaintance with, billions of suns, and around so many of these suns, planets, we now know, this is another fascinating thing about our time, within the last few years, we have the first empirical evidence that there actually are other planets orbiting other suns like our own. In fact, there are billions of these planets just in our own galaxy that are quite possibly, many of which have life, and undoubtedly some of which have evolved to have self-conscious life much like our own. So this is what's, the mystery is that infinite energy and hydrogen atoms will spontaneously organize, come together to form balls of molten rock, which is what our planet was 4.6 billion years ago. And somehow, when it cools enough, life emerges. Right? So these are the thresholds: particles, light, galaxies, life. And at a certain point, that life complexifies and expands in its diversity, at least under the right conditions, to give rise to, in our case, particularly mammals, and mammals with opposable thumbs and big enough brains, and the ability to speak and eventually form symbols. So this is another major threshold, is the symbol formation. Then there's the beginning of history. So if you were to place this along the line of 14 billion years ago, and if that line were, let's say, around 2 miles long, everything that we call history from the very earliest records would be just the last couple of centimeters on that 2 mile walk. Right? So everything that we're familiar with is so recent. And yet it seems that everything that preceded it is a kind of necessary preparation that allows for this flowering of consciousness. That consciousness is what makes possible not only the knowledge that we have gained. Of course, we've lost all kinds of knowledge and languages, cultural knowledge, but we have this scientific story, at least now, that is emerging, that's unparalleled. And we also have the great religious and spiritual traditions that have brought us teachings of wisdom and love and compassion. So all of that we could think of as is a very, very late flowering and fruit that happens in, cosmologically speaking, the very last milliseconds of this billion-year process. So, this is where we are, at least on this planet. And as you say, it's unparalleled, it's paradoxical, and maybe I'll just leave it at that for a moment.
Yeah, and consciousness. Tell us more about the flowering of consciousness and just how amazing it is that we're even able to have a conversation.
Yeah, well, if you think about it too much, at least when I think about it too much, it starts getting so paradoxical that words fail. But well, consciousness goes all the way down, I think, depending on how we define consciousness. But like Teilhard de Chardin thinks of consciousness as the interior of things, or the within of things. And he believed, and many others do, that there is a within all the way down to the simplest form, whether that's a hydrogen particle or a photon. So when we look at matter from the outside, we see matter, but we are matter. Our bodies are matter, our brains are matter. Matter is simply what is, looked at from the outside. But when you look at what is from the inside, it appears as consciousness. That's one way of thinking it. So consciousness, matter, energy are the two sides of an integral reality. Now it seems, though, that when we look at it from the outside, matter energy needs to get complex enough before the within, or consciousness, becomes aware of itself as consciousness, or self-consciousness arises. And symbols play a very important role in this. So for us, it's language, but not only language, it's any way that we shape our physical and cultural environment to become carriers of meaning.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, what kind of meaning is most meaningful for us?
Right. I know I've heard it said too about the introduction of language, introduction of tools, the introduction of fire as these key moments in consciousness flowering.
That's right. And in our culture, as you know, there's an overvaluation of the tools and the technology, and for understandable reasons, because we are vulnerable physical bodies, and the tools and the technology give us the illusion, at least, of control of our physical environment, and have certainly enabled us to make our physical lives, at least those of us who are privileged enough to benefit from the technology, have enabled us to make our physical lives a lot more comfortable and interesting in certain ways. But it's also this technology, particularly the technology that's wedded to industrial growth society, as Joanna Macy calls it, and global capitalism, that is destroying the very biological and ecological foundation that we depend upon. So that overvaluation of the instrumental, the technological, um, over against other forms of symbolic life, such as beauty, compassion, love, wisdom.
Yeah, and that brings the cosmic unfolding to the last couple hundred years, if you will, or 1,000 years narrowed down to 200 years, where the climate, if you will, on the planet has been stable long enough for this consciousness to flower, ourselves to flower. And that's a rare thing in itself. I think there's only been 3 other times that in the history that we know of the planet that there's been a long enough stretch for things to kind of settle in before even the natural dynamics of the planet would make it unlivable for so many life forms. And so here we are, we start to put things together 1,000 years ago, and then 200 years ago, we get to what you're talking about, the tool making, the technology, the fire, using fire, playing with fire, and all this technology in the Industrial Revolution, and that sets forth this chapter.
Yeah, I mean, well, of course, from one perspective, we're not the only ones to use tools. Like, other animals use tools, but because we have a particular genius with the domestication of fire, and then I mean, humans have been using tools for even our our hominid ancestors prior to our species. Were using tools of a certain source, of a certain kind. But after the modern period, with Newtonian science and then the Industrial Revolution, our tools and our sort of technological way of thinking assumed planetary proportions, and that's where things really started to go off the scale. I mean, and it's associated with the human population. So if you look at the graphs of human population, they're stable for thousands and thousands of years, and then around the High Middle Ages, about 1,000 years ago, it starts to go up a little bit with the new plow and different farming techniques and so on. Of course, there's the Black Death where it dips, but there's a slow increase in population. But then after the birth of modern science, it starts to go up at an increasing rate. And then, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, it starts to go asymptotic. And so, and of course, it can't go to infinity. The graph mathematically wants to go to infinity, but we're on a finite planet, as you know, and we're already pushing up against, have pushed past actually the limits of sustainability. We're using something like 1.5 Earths every year relative to what can be sustainably maintained.
Yeah, and so all this population and all this desire for growth, progress, stuff, things, luxury that we've been marinated in now brings us to this point where we find that the delicate web of life is unraveling.
That's right. And so some people think it's just a population problem. It's not just a population problem. Clearly, there are too many people on the planet the way we're living. Now, whether, even if we could change the way we're living, so if we could switch within a few years to completely renewable energy, let's say, it still might not be enough with this many people. But I would say that population itself is not the main problem. It's a real problem, but it's not the main problem. It's the way we're living. And when I say we, I mean primarily the privileged so-called developed world, mostly the United States, Center, and Europe. It's true that China and Russia. It's true that China and South America and Africa and Southeast Asia, they're trying to match the living standards that we in the so-called West or the developed world have taken for granted, and the world won't be able to sustain it. But how can we tell them not to unless we can show the way by example of what's possible?
Yeah, and that's this point we find ourselves now that our consciousness is big enough, our science is big enough, our worldview, we can see the whole world now in an instant, and we can begin to get this snapshot of, oh my God, this doesn't add up at all. And there's zillions of ways you can go find out those details about the oceans, about the ice caps, about the rivers, about the soil, about the air, just about all of it, the oceans, everything is in system breakdown. Yeah. And we're just like going, oh my God, and so then we find ourselves in this position that says, what? And who am I? What are we doing? What what has previously been an existential spiritual pondering, if you will, has now rushed to the surface of, well, wait a minute, we could very well be tearing apart the web of life, and that could lead to some very, very strange and powerful and destructive turn of events.
Yeah, well, as you know, many people believe that not only it could, but that it almost certainly will lead to at least civilizational collapse, if not human species extinction. I don't know whether it will or not, but I and you and many other people we know certainly have the sense that we are in an end time of some kind or another. I mean, something has to end, and it seems likely that certain things will end. Certainly, the way of life that we take for granted can't go on indefinitely. It's just
that really feels like the key. Thanks for delineating that. Many people will argue whether extinction is going to happen or not to humans, but I think we really miss the point if we go all the way to the end of that. For starters, that we have to start with the web is being torn apart. That's going to lead to collapse of the most fragile people first, and then those fragile people are going to spread in the migration of distress and chaos. And that's going to break down other systems, and this domino effect that this business as usual cannot continue.
No.
Where that takes us is a big question mark, and it is fairly easy to look at some of the science and hypothesize that it's just going to spin out of control and lead to extinction of a lot of species, and in thinking that it could lead to the extinction of a lot of species, that it could lead to the extinction of humans. And that's so hard to just even say out loud.
Yeah, it is.
Here we find ourselves. And if you actually look at the evidence, it's hard to convince yourself that things are going to be okay.
It is. It is. So I personally don't allow myself very often the thought that things are going to be okay.
Yeah.
But I do remind myself that however bleak it looks, I can't be certain either that the worst is going to happen, because the system we're in is just too complex for that prediction to be made. But just pragmatically speaking, just as I need to, the best I can, prepare for my own inevitable death, I feel a certain responsibility to create space in my heart mind for the possibility, the inevitability sometime, how soon it is, of the death of what we as a species have always taken for granted. The biodiversity that we've enjoyed, the stable climate, It's the way it's been, at least for the past 10,000 years. So I'm pretty certain that that's going to be a thing of the past. So there are many things that I can be pretty confident of are coming to an end. And, you know, you and I, at least for now, don't have to worry about bombs dropping on us, and you know, we very rarely go hungry unless we want to, and so on. So we have a privilege, that time and a privilege where we can make space in our awareness to hold this, and we shouldn't expect everybody to do it. It's not everybody's karmic task to take that up, but somebody has to do it.
Right, and here we find ourselves, for whatever reason, drawn, fascinated, and we do have this little window that we can ponder this from the safety and comfort of the luxuries that we got born into for whatever reason. And here we are pondering, and this is where the question goes when people dare to really look and say, holy crap, it was already a terrible situation, and now we have some new political energy going on that seems to be not helping, let's say. And so, my God, what am I supposed to do? Who am I? What? And tell us more about how yourself and those who follow Joanna Macy dare to start to grapple with the situation.
Yeah, well, you know, Joanna and Peter Russell and I, as I was telling you earlier, met a couple of weeks ago to talk about these things, and we were pondering the both the similarities and the differences between our individual having to deal with our own individual deaths and mortality, which we all have to. You know, as the Buddha said, death is certain, time of death is uncertain, and we live day to day, most of us, with the, you know, illusion that life will go on as we're experiencing it more or less forever, until we get sick or we get a diagnosis or something happens. So if we were to individually find out tomorrow that we had 3 weeks to live, we imagine that, you know, what would we want to do? Now, that's one question. Then the analogy is, well, what if we as a species are getting a similar diagnosis? And of course, the diagnosis isn't certain, but many people are saying, look, there's a good chance that everything that you have known as a species is coming to an end very soon. Okay? So this is the analogy. Now, as an individual, it's pretty common, we know, that when people get such a diagnosis, one of the things that they want to do is clear up unfinished business. Many things happen. There's denial, there's panic, there's fear, there's grief. But once these stages of coming to terms with death, the early stages of denial and anger and grief, if they can be negotiated, often there's a peace that can come. There's a new potential for finding joy in the moment, for appreciating beauty, for remembering what matters most in life, what has made and what makes life worth living. This becomes extremely clear in the last moments we have, by all accounts. And another thing that happens, though, is the desire to take care of unfinished business. So if there's somebody that you've hurt that you want to ask forgiveness of, if there's you know, if there's some wrong you've done that you can actually make right before you go, there's just an instinctive ethical push to do that. So I've been asking myself, well, you know, let's say we are getting a similar diagnosis as a species. What's some of the unfinished business that would be important to take care of? And you know, there's a lot. I mean, in this country, you know, there's the whole history of what African Americans suffered in this country, in building this country, coming here as slaves and continuing to be systemically oppressed generation after generation. And before that, of course, is all the indigenous cultures and peoples who were exterminated and oppressed, and no reparations have been done. And so what could we do? Well, we could, as a country, I'm speaking as an American, I'm Canadian and I'm an American, I would, if I thought, well, we may only have a few months or years to live, what can we do to make things right? Well, how about honoring indigenous land treaties? How about giving some respect to the indigenous people? How about admitting what happened to the African Americans? So this is some of the unfinished business, and you if you're going out, you want to leave your household in good order. You don't want to leave your corpse for somebody to have to deal with. But you want to make arrangements so that people. So these are the kinds of questions I've been asking myself. What can we do as a culture and as a nation to
Right.
things?
And to some degree, even as you play with that maybe we'll be able to instigate some culture-wide vibe of that. But for me, everybody gets to deal with this how they deal with it. There's no right way to do it. However, this self-introspective, this self-assessment of where do I think we stand as a species and as a country and as an individual, and what can I do, even in myself, to have a ceremony to honor the things that haven't been honored by my species and by my country and by myself. And just the admitting and the owning, which often happen in the grief workshops that are starting to pop up more and more, is to dare to look at ourselves in a whole different mirror, it feels like, right? That just as you would if you got the diagnosis for your individual life, to have that for yourself, but also a bigger family-wide, statewide, countrywide, globe-wide, dominant species. Here we are, the dominant species. What's the role of a dominant species? Have we ever even stopped to ponder that? Right? And can I at least allow humanity to move through me in a way that says, wow, we did what we did. It feels like we did the best we knew how to do, of course. There's definitely judgment about humanity that shows up pretty strong. I was at a talk last night. The guy said the neatest thing. He says, we look at ourselves as fallen angels. We look at ourselves as these beautiful things that did wrong and need to be judged, when really we're this amazing cosmic story unfolding, and we're stardust that learned to think and became alive and dared to create the stuff that we created. And how can I hold myself amidst looking at the news that's likely to be coming forth over the course of the rest of my life, and sit there with that and say, wow, I want to be able to hold humanity accountable, but not guilty, and at the same time honor the beauty that we are, but at the same time acknowledge that we didn't quite figure it out.
Yeah, I like that, Peter. Yeah, I mean, you're reminding me of what Joanna has helped me see so much more clearly over the years, that the distinction that we naturally make sometimes between our personal and our collective being is somewhat artificial, because our deeper selves are not separate from each other and from the being of our other brothers and sisters and in the earth community, human or non-human. So yeah, I think one of the neat things that our time is inviting us to do, and that again, we who have the privilege to, especially we who have the privilege to do so, are being called to do, is to find ways of experiencing as personal the shared fate and destiny of what's happening to the whole web of life on the planet. And that's a great gift, like to remember. Like, even we never know how long our personal lives are going to last, and we certainly don't know how long our species or civilization is going to last. But to the extent that we can truly awaken to and experience in our bodies and heart minds the degree to which we're not alone as individuals. I mean, our culture makes us feel so alone, feel so separate from each other in our little nuclear families, our little isolated dwellings and fractured communities and so on. But we really are not alone. We are part of a single, unbreakable web of interbeing, web of life and interbeing on the planet. And I think to the extent that we can awaken to that, that will provide us unimaginable resources for dealing with the reality of the situation, and strength and sources of creative response that we can't really imagine, that may not be enough to get us out of out of the worst, but it'll certainly enable us to go through that passage with dignity and a deeper humanity than would otherwise be possible.
Yeah, boy, there it is. The daring to hold ourselves, daring to say just what you said, that we can go through what's coming up, whatever that looks like, and it's hard to imagine, and we don't know what order or what it's going to be exactly, but that somehow humanity can get the framework, or whoever's able to hold that and chooses to hold it, that dang it, I'm gonna help humanity move through this crisis, if you will, in as glorious a way as possible. I'm going to represent this species. I'm going to hold and as sacred as much as I can hold as sacred, while the things unraveling.
Exactly.
And that maybe in itself could be the one, if we had to tell somebody, here's what you can do. Hold yourself as so much more than just human. Hold yourself in the whole cosmic story, before the beginning and after the end, of consciousness unfolding and flowering, and help humanity be as humane as possible during the upcoming challenges that we face.
Yeah, exactly, Peter. And as we've spoken of before, it certainly helps me, and I know it helps you, and others are helped by having a, for lack of a better word, spiritual or metaphysical perspective on the nature of time and meaning and the soul, if you believe in the soul. I know that that's really important for me, but we don't have time to talk about that dimension of things today, unfortunately. Maybe we can meet again.
Yeah, I would like to go deeper, but I think that just by doing what we did too, it feels to me like we open up the possibility for people, not telling you what to think, but one of the things you're gonna need, if you're looking for what do I need, what can I do now, is that foundation to land on when your status quo gets rocked in a way that you couldn't imagine. Everything that you had put together to equal you, right? The careers and the stuff and the security and the luxuries and all that, as that unravels, that landing on a bigger story about who you are, as I call it, knowing myself beyond my humanity while I'm still here. And that, I think the baby step for that, not that it's a baby step, the big step is what we just did. Dare to, in a half an hour or so, hold a 14 billion year story and nurture ourselves and hold ourselves sacred within that grander perspective of who we are. Because the game that we signed up for, and I think created for ourselves somehow as the ultimate consciousness, is pushing us to forget that we are this connected web of life.
Exactly. And doing just as you say, Peter, is a profound act of resistance against the dominant paradigm, the dominant business as usual consciousness that would like us to limit our awareness to the cycle of tweets and the daily or hourly reports from Wall Street and so on. So the time frame of business as usual is so small, so narrow, and it corresponds to a view of individuals in the self as tiny little hard atoms that have no real connection with each other except as mediated through money. So, just as you said, what we're doing, even if it's only for half an hour or for a couple of minutes a day, to deepen into our sense of who we really are, that unimaginably long cosmic journey and our unbreakable interbeing with all that is a source of personal solace and actually an act of political defiance. So
yeah, thank you. And that can look different for everybody. That's nature, that's spirituality, that's creative arts, that's fighting for whatever cause drives you, whether it's save the whales or permaculture or whatever, that you sink the weight of your life behind what it is that your particular little conscious bag that we call ourselves is most drawn to do, and take yourself there in whatever way to know yourself beyond your humanity and dare to become a representative of humanity here in these crazy, chaotic times.